In a dramatic turn on the global stage, former United States President Donald Trump has signaled that Ukraine's long-held aspiration of joining the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, could be off the table in any future peace agreement with Russia. His remarks came just hours before Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky arrived in Washington for high-stakes talks at the White House, attended by a remarkable gathering of European leaders. Trump, fresh from a summit with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Alaska, suggested that peace could be achieved swiftly if Ukraine were willing to compromise on its NATO membership bid, and the future of Crimea, the peninsula seized by Russia in 2014. This controversial stance has stirred debate across diplomatic circles, as it not only contradicts NATO's commitment to Kiev's eventual membership, but also risks emboldening Moscow's aggressive posture. Zelensky, undeterred, has insisted on genuine and binding security guarantees for his nation, emphasizing that the sacrifices of Ukrainians in Kharkiv, Zaporizhzhia, and countless other towns under daily bombardment must not be disregarded. His visit to Washington is being described as unprecedented, with multiple European heads of state arriving with little notice to demonstrate unity. The sense of urgency is amplified by Russia's relentless strikes, killing civilians and undermining any optimism for near-term peace. While Trump speaks of swift deals and territorial concessions, European allies caution against premature agreements that could weaken Ukraine's sovereignty. Meanwhile, Washington's own diplomatic machinery, led by Secretary of State Marco Rubio, is balancing between Trump's overtures to Moscow and NATO's core principle of collective defense. Against this tense backdrop, the world now watches closely as Zelensky and his counterparts attempt to chart a path forward, one that could either solidify Ukraine's security or lock in dangerous precedents for European stability. Donald Trump's declaration that there will be no going into NATO by Ukraine, if peace is to be achieved, reflects both his transactional style of diplomacy and his desire to frame negotiations in terms of immediate deliverables. While Trump portrays NATO membership as expendable, for Ukraine and its allies the issue goes far beyond symbolism. NATO represents not only military protection, but also political inclusion in the Western order. By publicly rejecting that path, Trump effectively echoes long-standing Russian red lines, strengthening President Vladimir Putin's narrative that NATO expansion threatens Russia's security. This position risks undermining NATO unity at a critical juncture. Just months ago, member states reaffirmed Ukraine's irreversible path toward membership, signaling commitment in the face of Russian aggression. By contrast, Trump's stance raises doubts about whether Washington will stand firm on collective promises. Furthermore, dismissing the return of Crimea, a territory annexed illegally, may normalize territorial conquest, setting a dangerous precedent for other authoritarian regimes. Critics argue that such concessions could embolden Moscow to continue military campaigns in Donbas and beyond. The larger implication is psychological as much as strategic. If Kiev perceives abandonment by the United States, its morale and negotiating power diminish sharply. Conversely, Moscow interprets such rhetoric as validation of its strategy of attrition. While Trump may believe he is paving the way for a swift peace deal, his words risk signaling weakness at a time when unity and clarity of purpose are essential. The outcome may not be peace, but rather prolonged instability. President Volodymyr Zelensky enters the Washington talks under extraordinary pressure. His country continues to suffer devastating attacks, with strikes in Kharkiv and Zaporizhzhia killing civilians only hours before his arrival. Against this backdrop, Zelensky must project both resilience and pragmatism. He cannot afford to appear inflexible, yet any concession on NATO membership or territorial integrity risks domestic backlash and constitutional constraints. Ukrainian law explicitly forbids surrendering territory, making Trump's suggestion of recognizing Russian control over Crimea or Donbas legally and politically unworkable. Zelensky's strategy has been to seek binding NATO-like security guarantees. By framing the issue around protection rather than membership, he attempts to address Western reluctance while still ensuring Ukraine's defense. His repeated emphasis on genuine guarantees, not vague assurances like those of 1990, reflects the lessons of history when promises failed to deter Russian aggression. This messaging also resonates with European allies, who see such guarantees as a possible compromise that maintains Ukraine's sovereignty while lowering the immediate risk of escalation. Yet Zelensky faces an uphill struggle. He must counter the narrative that he alone can end the war if he wants to, as Trump suggested, while reminding the world that Russia remains the aggressor. The optics of his visit, joined by European leaders, are designed to bolster his position, showing that Ukraine is not isolated. His challenge is to transform symbolic solidarity into tangible commitments that prevent Ukraine from being forced into a deal that sacrifices its long-term independence for short-term peace. The rush of European leaders to Washington underscores the stakes for the continent. From London to Berlin, governments fear that Trump's overtures to Moscow may tilt negotiations toward concessions that weaken collective security. The presence of figures such as French President Emmanuel Macron, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, and European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen highlights a rare display of urgency and unity for Europe. The war in Ukraine is not a distant conflict, but a direct challenge to the post-World War II security order. European officials are particularly concerned about Trump's readiness to strike deals without Ukraine's participation, as seen in the recent Trump-Putin summit in Alaska. Such exclusion not only undermines Kyiv, but also destabilizes Europe's faith in Washington as a reliable partner. Leaders fear that if Trump pressures Zelensky into accepting territorial losses or abandoning NATO ambitions, the precedent will embolden Russia and potentially threaten states along NATO's eastern flank. At the same time, Europe is navigating its own limits. While military aid has flowed to Kyiv, fatigue among populations and economic pressures complicate sustained support. Leaders arriving in Washington aim to balance firmness with pragmatism, ensuring that Ukraine's sovereignty is preserved without escalating into a wider war. The European calculus is clear. Peace is desirable, but not at the cost of legitimizing aggression. Their collective presence at the White House is intended to signal unity, but whether Trump interprets it as solidarity or interference remains an open question. While Ukraine and its allies deliberate over guarantees and alliances, Russia continues to exert military and diplomatic leverage. Moscow controls nearly 1/5 of Ukrainian territory, including swaths of Donetsk and Luhansk, giving it bargaining chips in any negotiation. Putin has consistently opposed Ukraine's NATO membership, framing it as a red line. Now, with Trump echoing that position, Russia may sense an opportunity to lock in strategic gains without making substantial concessions. Recent reports suggest that Putin signaled openness to a NATO-like security arrangement for Ukraine, but such offers remain ambiguous. Russia's history of violating agreements, from the Minsk Accords to the Budapest Memorandum, raises doubts about its credibility. Moreover, continued Russian strikes against civilian areas reveal a dual strategy, negotiating on one hand while inflicting pressure on the battlefield. This pattern suggests Moscow's aim is not simply peace, but a settlement on its terms. Looking ahead, the road is fraught with uncertainty. A peace deal that excludes NATO membership but offers security guarantees may provide temporary relief, but its durability depends on enforcement mechanisms. Without credible deterrence, Ukraine risks facing renewed aggression. The outcome of the Washington talks will therefore shape not only Ukraine's immediate survival, but also the credibility of Western security commitments. If Russia emerges with recognition of its territorial seizures and a weakened NATO stance, the consequences will reverberate across Europe and beyond, potentially reshaping the global order for years to come.